She treated a customer with kindness and lost her job for it, but the next day she walked back in as the boss. Jenna wasn't the type to seek out trouble. She never had been. She wasn't the kind of person who caused drama or picked fights. She believed in showing up, doing her work, and treating everyone with respect. It was how she had been brought up, simple values. Work hard, respect others, and keep quiet when things got messy. But sometimes doing the right thing came with consequences, and Jenna was about to find that out the hard way. For almost 3 years, Rivers Diner had felt like home to her. It wasn't fancy, just a small diner on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, tucked between a gas station and a dry cleaner. It was the kind of place where truck drivers grabbed a cup of coffee, where families gathered for weekend breakfasts, and where the staff remembered your order before they knew your name. It was the kind of job that could easily be taken for granted. The hours were long, the pay wasn't great, and the management hardly cared. But Jenna stuck with it. She had bills to pay, and her rent was already too high for a small apartment. Her younger brother, Sam, was in his second year of college. He didn't know that she helped pay for his books and groceries when their mom couldn't. She never told him, just sent a little extra when she could. That's why she worked the extra shifts. Why she put up with customers who didn't even look at her and coworkers who acted like being kind was a weakness. She had witnessed things at this diner that made her stomach turn. The way Linda, a senior waitress, treated some customers as if they didn't matter while flirting with others. How Mike, a newer server, avoided certain tables altogether. How the whole mood of the diner shifted depending on who came in. It wasn't just about the tips. A well-dressed businessman would get a warm smile and a chat, while a working-class person in a paint-stained shirt would get rushed service. And if someone looked like they might not leave a tip, some of the staff wouldn't even bother to try. Jenna hated it, but speaking up wasn't an option. She'd learned that lesson the hard way a few months back. When she'd casually mentioned that a table had been waiting too long, while Linda lingered by the counter scrolling on her phone. Linda had looked her right in the eye and said, "You don't get paid extra for being a saint, Jenna." That was how things worked. Either you went along with it, or you kept quiet. Jenna chose the quiet path until that night. And after that night, everything would change. The dinner rush had passed, and it was a quiet Wednesday evening, the kind Jenna actually preferred. Fewer customers meant fewer complaints, fewer spills, and fewer fake smiles from her coworkers, who only turned on the charm when it suited them. She was standing at the counter refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door jingled. An older black man walked in. His clothes were clean but a little worn, not flashy, just a simple button-up shirt and slacks. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, but there was something in the way he moved. He paused for a brief moment, scanning the room before stepping forward. Jenna recognized that hesitation. She had seen it before, especially in customers who already knew what kind of welcome they were about to get, or more likely, what kind they weren't about to get. And sure enough, the response came quickly. Linda, leaning against the counter, didn't even look up from her phone. Mike, who had been joking with another server by the drink station, glanced at the door, made eye contact with the man for a split second, then went right back to his conversation. No greeting. No, "Welcome to Rivers Diner." Just silence. Jenna felt the weight of it, thick and uncomfortable. This wasn't a mistake. Her coworkers had made a choice. For a second, she thought about keeping her head down, staying out of it. It would be easier. It always was. But when she glanced at the man again, the way he stood there waiting, like he was giving them a chance to prove him wrong, just this once, Jenna made her choice. She wiped her hands on a napkin, grabbed a menu, and walked straight over. "Evening, sir," she said, her voice warm but casual. "Just you tonight?" The man met her eyes, and something in his expression softened. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. Jenna smiled and gestured toward an open booth near the window. "Follow me." "You okay with the booth?" "Perfectly fine," he replied, settling in. She handed him the menu and pulled a pen from behind her ear. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Coffee," he said, "black." "Coming right up." Jenna moved quickly, grabbing a fresh pot and pouring his cup herself. She could feel Linda's eyes on her, feel Mike watching too, but she didn't turn around. As she set the coffee down in front of him, he glanced around the diner, then back at her. "You the only one working tonight?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Jenna knew exactly what he meant. She flicked a glance at the others, where Linda was whispering something to Mike, both of them barely hiding their smirks. "Feels like it sometimes," Jenna said. That made him chuckle. He flipped open the menu and started scanning the options. "What's good here?" John tilted his head, thinking. "Depends on what you're in the mood for," Jenna replied. "If you're looking for something hearty, the pot roast is made fresh. But if you want my personal favorite, the grilled salmon's the way to go." He raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" Jenna nodded. "Promise you won't regret it." He smiled, small but sincere. "Salmon it is." Jenna jotted it down. Great choice. As she walked back to the kitchen, she heard Linda mutter, just loud enough for her to hear, "She's wasting her time." Jenna clenched her jaw but kept walking. By the time she placed the order and returned with a fresh coffee refill, she could feel a shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. The way Linda's eyes narrowed, the way Mike kept glancing toward the booth, as if waiting for Jenna to mess up or say something she shouldn't. Even Tom, the manager, peeked out from his office, scanning the room before disappearing again. Jenna had a sinking feeling that she'd just made herself a target, but she wouldn't know how bad it was until the next morning. Jenna barely slept. There was something about the way Linda had muttered, the way Mike had smirked, and the way Tom had peeked out that gave her a bad feeling. But she tried to tell herself she was overthinking it. She had done nothing wrong. If anything, she had done exactly what a waitress was supposed to do, serve customers. So why did her stomach twist as she pulled into Rivers Diner's parking lot the next morning? The air was crisp, and the sun was just starting to peek over the buildings as she grabbed her apron from the passenger seat and slung it over her shoulder. A couple of cars were already in the lot, including Tom's. Jenna stepped inside, expecting the usual, Linda and Mike chatting around, the kitchen crew prepping for the morning shift, the radio playing softly in the background. But something felt off. Linda wasn't leaning against the counter like usual. Mike wasn't making coffee or cracking jokes with the line cooks. Instead, both of them were watching her. Linda had a sly smile on her face. Mike had his arms crossed. Neither of them said a word. Jenna's grip tightened on her apron. Then she heard the door creak open. It was Tom. He stood in the doorway of his office, looking at her like he'd been waiting for her to walk in. "Jenna," he said flatly, "come with me." A cold pit settled in her stomach. Tom didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back into his office. Jenna swallowed hard. She could feel Linda and Mike still watching her as she made her way to the back. She took a deep breath, straightened up, and stepped inside. The office was cramped, the desk covered in papers and old coffee stains. A file sat open in front of Tom, but he wasn't looking at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, let out a slow breath, and said, "We're letting you go." The words hit like a punch. Jenna blinked, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just heard. Tom's expression didn't change. "It's not working out," he added. Her heart raced. "Not working out," she repeated, letting out a sharp laugh, one that had no humor in it. "I've been here almost 3 years. I've never missed a shift, never been late." Tom exhaled through his nose as though he was already tired of the conversation. "It's a decision we've made." Jenna knew exactly what that meant. Her throat tightened. This is because of last night, isn't it? Tom didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. His silence said it all. Jenna felt heat rise to her face. So, I get fired for doing my job? She asked, barely holding back her anger. Tom's fingers tapped the desk. You can collect your final paycheck next week. That was it. No warning, no explanation, just out. Jenna clenched her fists, but she knew there was no point in arguing. She untied her apron and set it on the chair. As she turned to leave, she hesitated at the door, forcing herself to look back at Tom. You know this isn't right, she said, her voice steady. Tom didn't even flinch. Jenna shook her head and walked out. Linda was still standing near the counter when Jenna stepped back into the main dining area. A knowing smirk was on her face. Mike was pretending to wipe down a table, but he wasn't even trying to hide the satisfaction in his eyes. They had been waiting for this moment. Jenna's face burned, not with embarrassment, but with anger. She wanted to say something, to call them out, to make a scene, to demand to know how they could be so cold. But she didn't. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She lifted her chin, walked past them without a word, and pushed through the doors into the cold morning air. For the first time in 3 years, she had no job, no paycheck, no backup plan. She got into her car, slammed the door shut, and gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. How was she going to pay rent? How was she going to help Sam with his groceries? Her phone buzzed. Jenna ignored it at first, staring blankly at the windshield, her thoughts spinning. Then she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated, then, with a shaking hand, answered. Hello? A deep voice came through the line, steady and familiar. Jenna, this is Richard Lawson. Jenna frowned. I'm sorry, who? The man you served last night at River's Diner. Her breath caught, and she sat up a little straighter. Oh, yes, sir. How can I help you? There was a pause, then Richard said, I heard what happened. Jenna's stomach twisted. Of course he had. News traveled fast in places like River's Diner. Yeah, well, she said, forcing out a bitter laugh. I guess I should have just ignored you like everyone else. Richard's next words made her freeze. That's exactly why I'm calling, because this wasn't the end of your story. It was just the beginning. Jenna's grip on the phone tightened. She had no idea why Richard Lawson, just another customer or so she thought, was calling her the morning after she had been fired. Her heart pounded as she sat up straighter in the driver's seat. I'm sorry, what do you mean? There was a pause on the other end. Then Richard's voice came through, steady and deliberate. I wasn't just there for dinner last night, Jenna, he said. I was there to see how my employees treat people. Jenna blinked. Your employees? I own River's Diner, Richard said simply. For a moment, the words didn't register. She sat frozen, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and shock. I'm sorry, what? She finally managed. You heard me, he said. Jenna pressed her fingers to her temple. So, you're telling me you own this place? Yes, Richard replied. And last night you were, what? She asked, still processing. Checking in, more or less, Richard said. I make it a habit to visit my restaurants unannounced. No formal inspections, no warning. I come in as just another customer. That's how you learn the truth about how a business is being run. Jenna's chest felt tight. And what did you learn? She asked. Richard sighed. That I have a serious problem with my staff. Jenna let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, no kidding. There was another pause, then Richard asked, How long have you worked there? Almost 3 years, she said. 3 years, and I've never missed a shift, never been late. I keep my head down, do my job, and treat people like human beings. She exhaled, frustration creeping into her voice. But apparently, that was enough to get me fired. That's exactly why I'm calling, Richard said. Jenna furrowed her brows. I don't understand. Richard was quiet for a moment before speaking again. I let them fire you on purpose. Her stomach dropped. You what? I needed to see what they would do, Richard explained. I wanted to know if this was just about bad service or if it was something deeper, Richard continued, and now I have my answer. Jenna shook her head. So? You let them fire me just to prove a point? I know it wasn't fair, Richard admitted, but now I know exactly who I can't trust to run my business the way it should be run. Jenna felt her pulse thumping in her ears. And what does that mean for me? There was a shift in Richard's tone, something firm, almost authoritative. It means I need someone I can trust, he said. I need someone who actually understands what it means to run a restaurant fairly, someone who doesn't pick and choose, who gets treated with dignity based on their own prejudices. Jenna frowned. I still don't see what this has to do with me. Richard's next words stopped her cold. I want you to come back, he said, as the new manager. Jenna's breath caught. Her brain scrambled to process what she had just heard. I what? You heard me, Richard said. I fired your manager this morning. Tom's done. Jenna's mouth fell open. Beth and Mike are going to lose their minds. Richard continued, I know this is sudden, but I'm not interested in anyone else taking over. You understand what matters in a workplace. You know how people should be treated. That's exactly what Rivers Diner needs. Jenna swallowed hard. I don't know if I can do this. Yes, you can, Richard said firmly, and you should. She stared out the windshield, her mind spinning. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been tossed aside like she didn't matter, and now she was being offered the very position of the man who had fired her. She took a slow breath. What do you say? Richard asked. Jenna hesitated. She could still hear Linda's mocking voice, Mike's smug silence, Tom's dismissive tone. They had counted her out, thought they had gotten rid of her for good. But now she had a chance to be the change they never saw coming. Jenna lifted her chin, gripping the phone a little tighter. I'll do it, she said. Richard let out a satisfied breath. Good. Come in tomorrow morning. You start at 8. Jenna nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll be there. As she hung up, she sat in stunned silence for a moment, gripping the wheel as the reality of it all sank in. Less than a day ago, she had walked out of Rivers Diner with nothing. Tomorrow she would be walking back in as the boss, and she wasn't coming to play nice. Jenna stood outside Rivers Diner, gripping the strap of her bag. The morning air was sharp, the kind of chill that cut right through your clothes, but she barely felt it. She had spent all night thinking about this moment. Yesterday she had walked out of this building with nothing. No job, no explanation, no respect. Today she was walking back in with the one thing Linda, Mike, and Tom had never imagined she would have: power. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and pushed open the door. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, just like it always had. Customers were scattered across the booths, forks clinking against plates, the low hum of conversation blending with the radio playing softly in the background. At first, nobody noticed her. Then Linda turned from the counter, saw her, and froze. Mike, who had been laughing with a busboy, caught sight of her too. His mouth snapped shut mid-sentence, confusion and unease crossing his face. It was almost too perfect. Jenna let the moment stretch just long enough for them to squirm before walking toward the counter, setting her bag down with purpose. Linda recovered first. She scoffed, crossing her arms. What the hell are you doing here? Jenna tilted her head. You'll find out soon enough. Linda's smirk faltered. Before she could say anything else, a door opened at the back of the restaurant. Tom stepped out of his office, already looking irritated, flipping through a stack of papers. Linda, I need you to... Then he saw her. His whole body went rigid. His eyes flicked to Linda, then Mike, like he was trying to piece together what was happening. Jenna, he said slowly, you don't work here anymore. Jenna smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, she said, I do. Tom blinked. What? Before she could answer, another voice cut in. I believe I can clarify that. Every head in the room turned. Richard Lawson walked in, calm and collected as ever, his hands in the pockets of his tailored coat. He scanned the room, taking his time before landing on Tom. Linda's face paled. Mike looked like he wished he could disappear. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. Richard stopped beside Jenna and turned to face the staff. His voice was steady, measured, but carried authority. As of this morning, Rivers Diner has undergone some management changes, he said. Effective immediately, Tom. Your position is terminated. Linda gasped. Mike looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Tom's face turned an ugly shade of red. Wait a damn minute, no. Richard cut him off. I've already heard enough from you. Tom's mouth snapped shut. Jenna almost felt bad. Almost. Richard turned toward the rest of the staff. Some of you may be wondering what's going on. Let me make it simple. Last night I visited this restaurant as a regular customer. He let the words sink in, and what I witnessed was unacceptable. Nobody dared to speak. Richard gestured toward Jenna. This woman was the only employee who treated me with respect, the only one who did her job the way it should be done. He turned back to the staff, his expression hardening. The rest of you, some of you ignored me completely. Some of you made it clear you had no interest in serving certain customers at all. His voice sharpened. That ends today. The silence in the restaurant was thick. Then Richard turned back to Jenna. Jenna is your new manager? Linda's mouth fell open. Mike's jaw clenched. The busboy standing near the kitchen looked like he wanted to clap. Jenna finally let herself smile. She turned toward Linda and Mike, who were still stunned into silence, and leaned against the counter. Well, she said lightly, this is awkward. Linda's expression twisted. You? She turned to Richard, her voice sharp. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Richard said. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. Linda snapped her mouth shut, nostrils flaring. She wasn't stupid. She knew walking out meant losing her paycheck, and Linda wasn't about to do that. Mike, on the other hand, wasn't as smart. This is bulls, Richard cut him off. You're welcome to quit as well. Mike froze. His mouth opened, then closed as he seemed to do the math in his head. Linda glared daggers at Jenna, but Jenna just smiled back. Looks like we all have a lot of adjusting to do, Jenna said, her voice light but firm. So, let's get to work. She watched as Linda stormed toward the coffee machine, mumbling under her breath. Mike grabbed a rag and started wiping down a table, his movements stiff with anger. Richard gave Jenna a knowing look. I have a feeling you'll do just fine here, he said. Jenna exhaled, watching as the restaurant settled into a new reality, one where she was in charge. And for the first time since she walked into this building 3 years ago, she felt something she hadn't before: respect. The next few weeks were interesting. Jenna had expected resistance. She welcomed it. Linda barely spoke to her unless necessary, her usual smirks replaced with tight-lipped silence. Mike sulked through every shift, making it painfully obvious that he was only sticking around because he had no better options. A few other servers, who had always played, along with the old culture of favoritism. Some employees gritted their teeth and adjusted. Others didn't. A couple of employees quit in the first week without bothering to give notice, just stormed out. When it became clear that the way things used to work, the unspoken rules about who deserved good service and who didn't, were over. Jenna didn't lose sleep over it. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make things right. She spent her first days as manager observing, taking note of who was actually putting in the work, who was resistant to change, and who just needed a push in the right direction. Slowly, things started to change. The kitchen staff, who had always kept their heads down, began to speak up more, offering suggestions, pointing out when things were unfair. The younger servers, who had followed the lead of people like Linda and Mike, started watching Jenna instead. One night, a busboy, Noah, a college kid who worked nights to pay for school, stopped her as she was wiping down the counter. "You really got rid of Tom for that?" he asked, his voice careful. Jenna looked up. "For what?" "For being a jackass to customers," Noah said. "I mean, we all knew it happened, but I didn't think anyone actually cared." Jenna set the rag down and looked him in the eye. "I care." Noah hesitated, then nodded. "Good." And just like that, things started to shift. It wasn't immediate, but over time, the entire energy of River's Diner began to change. People noticed. Customers who had been ignored in the past started coming in more often, smiling when they saw Jenna behind the counter. Regulars, who had never spoken much, started opening up, chatting about their day, tipping more than they used to. Even the staff, those who had been skeptical at first, began following her lead. Then one afternoon, Richard Lawson walked in. Jenna was in the middle of balancing invoices when she heard his voice. "How's my investment doing?" She turned, pushing the paperwork aside, and smirked. "I think we're in good shape." Richard glanced around the restaurant. It was busy, not just with customers, but with a different kind of energy than before. The staff moved with purpose, the atmosphere lighter. The tension that had once been there was now gone. Richard nodded, satisfied. "Told you you'd be fine." Jenna leaned against the counter. "You didn't exactly give me a choice?" Richard chuckled. "No, I didn't." Jenna exhaled, looking around. "It's weird," she admitted. "For the longest time, this job was just a job, a paycheck. And now it's something more." Richard's expression softened. "Funny how life works, huh?" Jenna thought back to that morning, sitting in her car, feeling like she had lost everything. And yet, here she was. She wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was the boss. And she had made damn sure that River's Diner would never go back to the way it was. Because doing the right thing wasn't always easy. Sometimes it cost you everything. But sometimes it gave you more than you ever imagined. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because integrity matters, and it starts with how we treat each other.